What up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS here with Dr. Jared Ball, and you're tuned into episode 6 of The Last Dope Intellectual. So Jared Ball, for this segment of Shoot the Shit, we have an article that we're gonna address, right? So
but
it's
Dr.
called
CBS, can I interrupt you first? I'm sorry.
Can
I interrupt? I want to interrupt first because we got to talk about the shirt situation real quick.
Hey, free
because
Angela Davis and all political prisoners. And you got the George Jackson?
Unplanned, unscripted, black and white, Angela Davis, George Jackson. I just wanted to point that out. It just worked out that way. Just the natural flow of LDI, the LDI crew. That's how it gets done around here.
Mutual comradeship, man. Mutual comradeship. We're here. And now we're about to be here on dragging this article. So, so this piece is called Amanda Gorman and the Perils of Racial Profiling. And so the question that I pose to you when we're talking about what we're talking about is, should the Black elite be exempt from racism? Because one reads this piece, right? And what unfolds is this idea that Amanda Gorman, poet laureate, right? Harvard undergraduate, prominent figure, was subjected to some racial profiling. She was followed by a security guard. Okay. But then when you read it, you get the sense that, again, this whole discourse, like even the rich, even the affluent, even the successful are still Black, basically, right? They're still subjected to the same types of racial issues that the other Blacks are subjected to. I just take exception to that narrative. It gives me caste vibes. But before I go into that, like, what is your perspective of this?
I think I was headed in that same direction. I just, my first reaction is always that the people who seem to willingly accept entree into spaces where they are highly promoted to give cover to imperialism and capitalism and anti-Blackness, to give cover and hope that this system can make room if you are just talented enough, just attractive enough. That they would then come across some of the same, hostility and antagonisms that the rest of us get on a regular daily basis, and that this is somehow supposed to mean something more is frustrating to me. It's frustrating because, again, on the one hand, both individually and at a societal level, these folks are accepting a position and all of the benefits of it, and then can turn around and then, also become the symbol for the most egregious forms of this oppressive society. So somewhere in there, I find a lot of frustration. But it also reminded me just quickly of a couple of things that I'll just throw out very quickly. One, I just made a couple of notes when you sent this for us to consider. I thought of the importance again of No Name's decision to refuse participation in the Judas soundtrack. Because to me, that's the kind of principled relative celebrity response to being offered entry into these spaces. Anyway, those were just some of my initial reactions to this story.
Okay, so the plot thickens, right? In this article, it says Gorman went on to say in a following tweet in response to the provocation, so her mentioning that she got followed, quote, "In a sense, he was right. I am a threat to injustice, to inequality, to ignorance. Anyone who wants to speak the truth and walk with hope is an obvious and fatal danger to the powers that be." Okay. Amanda Gorman is the person who gave that infamous poem at the inauguration that celebrated essentially American imperialism, that reified this idea that the U.S. is the greatest nation in the world. And now that Biden is president and Trump is gone, we can now overcome. There is nothing threatening about this person. And indeed, and in fact, as you just discussed, she is one of the people who reify empire, who reify the status quo, and who pose no threat whatsoever. And so there's a way in which this sort of race hustle and this is what lends to the caste thing that I'll get into in a second, but there's a way in which this race hustle, because of racism, like you mentioned, racism to obfuscate the way in which you are very much ensconced in this system, right? And that, again, like I talked about ad nauseum at this point, the but for logic, right? So for her, it's like, I'm an American and I belong and I work hard, but racism. And so racism makes me a threat. And it's like, you're not a threat at all, right? And so it's as if these individual experiences of whatever racial profiling, et cetera, all of a sudden make you into fucking Asada Shakur and shit. And it's like, nah, sis, like we heard you, we know you. And so it's just very, very frustrating. And I keep relating it to the caste, the book Caste, because that's essentially Wilkerson's argument that like what illuminates that, Black people are a lower caste is because even the rich, even the affluent, even the achievers, even the people who have done everything right, even the people who are at the top of meritocracy continue to be subjected to these slights or these indignities or these forms of, of quotidian racism. Of course, but she doesn't really talk about racism. She talks about caste. So that's a whole other thing. But it's this whole idea that these Black elites can be like, see, we're just like you. Like, it doesn't, like, class doesn't matter, because no matter what class we're in, we're still subjected to racism, just like those Blacks, right? And so this is what sort of allows them to evade a critique of capitalism or a critique of class and turn to goofy shit like caste. And so it's just, the unmitigated nerve of this one.
And they're not taking
she's a threat.
And I think to your point, though, of almost all of your work, they're not a threat because of the analysis or the organization they're involved in or offering. They're a threat, at least theoretically, because they are racialized or gendered in a way, or labeled in a way that other groups are more commonly oppressed, and that it takes away so much of what I think is also the problem of celebrity, where, as I continue to argue, you can't be rich, famous, and radically political all at the same time. And yet these folks continue to try to perform as if they are. And then to the point of all the stuff you've been talking about, in previous shows and in your work. So then where does Paul Robeson, if you can be an artist and be, and then where does Robeson show up, or Claude McKay, or as a poet, and it reminds me, just lastly, of when I think something that Harold Cruz wrote, where he cautioned about what happens when your expression becomes part of the cultural store of the nation. I think he put it.
Sure. Yeah.
Anyway.
Yep. Okay. Another salacious detail. Let me just tell you this, okay? Gorman has overcome many obstacles in her journey toward academic, intellectual, and literary success at a young age. Born in Los Angeles on March 7th, 1998, the product of a single mother who was an educator, the poet laureate worked on an auditory and speech impediment to become an acclaimed writer and public lecturer. Now, I don't mean to be ableist in the slightest. I'm sure that was traumatic. But what immediately came to mind with that was when I remember on Twitter, Kris Jenner had mentioned about Kendall Jenner, like that she had bravely shared her story about a struggle that she had gone through. And that struggle turned out to be acne.
Oh, wow.
Acne. So this was part of her whole proactive deal. But it was like Kendall had the courage to talk about how she struggled with acne. Okay. And this is not to say, like, speech impediments are hard, right? We know that, like, James Earl Jones had one. They try to say Biden had one, and that's why his ass was forgetting shit and all that. But anyway. Right. And so it's a thing, but like, these are the trials and tribulations that are mentioned, and then the whole single mother thing. And it's not, I grew up in a single mother household, but the way that that's constructed as like an obstacle to overcome just reifies this whole like cult, Black people ain't got no daddies.
It's also anti-Black male. That's where I was taking it too. It's another shot at the absent Black male father. But as someone who has to be out here every day, beige and bald, I have to overcome these obstacles, and I would like some credit and acknowledgement for that. So, hashtag whatever that puts, category Me Too or whatever, put me in that one.
Hashtag sunscreen.
Hashtag I suffer too. Hashtag I'm oppressed. You know, I mean,
Listen, and we, whatever, we're sort of making light of the situation, but and this also, for example, they put her in this lineage with Mahalia Jackson, and people, and Mahalia Jackson, who actually was part of the civil rights movement and who was part of an organization, right? Or she collaborated closely with like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and did concerts on behalf of the civil rights movement. Last I checked, Amanda Gorman did a poem on behalf of empire, that is to say the U.S. administration. And so there's this way in which we collapse all of these, like everything into Black girl magic, or everything into girl boss, or everything into this idea, this sort of undifferentiated idea of race, whereby like a sin against the Black elite is a sin against the Black people in general, or the achievement of one Black person represents progress for all Black people. And like, as we know, this is just complete bullshit. And then there's also mention of people like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And so it's also so fucking unethical to mention her brief encounter, which she survived, by the way, with some security guard, and put that in the same breath or conversation as George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, who are victims of state repression and state violence. And it's only through our liberal discourse that we can see these things as synonymous, or see these things as part of a sort of a similar or an equal articulation. And it's the same shit that Isabel Wilkerson, again, was doing in Cass, where she would mention lynching and all of this extreme brutality against Black people. And in the next breath, mention that like some white man was mean to her in first class. Like, it's, so rich Black people, yes, your ass is still Black and you might suffer discrimination, but the difference between you and the Black pores that you're trying to read yourself into is that oftentimes they do not make it out of those encounters. Oftentimes they are brutalized, criminalized, and then forgotten about, right? Whereas you can tweet about the situation and you'll probably get some fucking endorsement deal from, I don't know, Nike to get you some Nikes to run away from the situation or whatever. I don't know. But it's a no for me. I'm not here for that. And, yes, racism and white supremacy are real, but so are class differences. And so is the need to lift up the actual, or the sort of widespread forms of state violence and economic terrorism and political disenfranchisement that the majority of our people suffer, and not, put all of our indignation and sympathy behind that.
Let your experience with the nightmare of a security guard lead you to a critique of an administration that would add money and revenue to those policing services and already bomb Syria while denying us actual health care and relief, and Somalia without relief and support for people here. So that would be, I think, a good way to address those class differences for sure.
And Amanda Gorman, if you're watching, join a fucking organization. Like, use those powers for good. Let No Name be your guide. Like, be part of a movement or organizing efforts, to put your prestige where your mouth is. And I'm sorry that security guard hurt your feelings. But you hurt our feelings, our being the Black radical left, when you did that raggedy ass poem. So that's it. Weigh in, let us know what you think about this article and about this situation. But that's what me and Jared think. So
let No Name be your guide.
Okay, y'all. So I'm introducing yet another new segment. This one is called Class in Session. And with this segment, I really want to talk to youth, students, and young folk about their experience on campuses, about their organizing and activism work, and about what it means to be like Gen Z in this moment, in the moment of perpetual crisis, of heightened imperialism, of, turbo disaster capitalism. And so we really want to pay attention to the perspective of our young folk, because the children are the future, so to speak. And so today I have a very, very dope young person with me, Yolian Ogbu. And so let me read her bio. So Yolian is a political science student at the University of North Texas. She recently served as the student government president from 2019 to 2020, engaged in climate justice work with This Is 0 Hour, and is now an organizing member of Horn of Africa, Pan-Africans for Liberation and Solidarity, HOA PALS for short, where she works with a dedicated group on building Pan-Africanist, anti-imperialist political education for the diaspora and beyond. And let me just tell you, I heard Yolian speak on an intergenerational webinar, and she absolutely killed it. And I immediately found her on social media, had to reach out to her and just let her know, like, you know, with all the stuff we have going on, with her at the helm, her and her comrades at the helm, I do think that we have, you know, we can win. So welcome, Yolian Ogbu.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. Thank you so much for being here. So let me start with my first question to you. As I mentioned, you're a member of HOA PALS, which is a member organization of the Black Alliance for Peace. How did this organization come about, and what is the goals or aims of your org?
Yeah, so HOA PALS was created about like in the summer of last year. We kind of had a small group of people from kind of all over come together, and we were all just really concerned about the state of like political consciousness in the diaspora within the Horn, but then also like on the continent itself. So we kind of all came together and we said, well, I mean, we shouldn't waste time and continue complaining that there isn't a space. Let's create this space. So our whole aim with HOA PALS is to use political education to equip cadre to be revolutionary members of our community in the diaspora and in the Horn of Africa. And we aim for the diaspora and the region's political conversations to be shifted from liberalism towards a more like radical consideration and analysis. So what we're doing is building a platform that hopefully seeks to educate the diaspora and challenges us to learn and unlearn, increase consciousness, and learn how to become better comrades for liberation struggles here and abroad. So we know that the focus of this entire space that we're creating, our formation, is on the foundation of political education, but kind of we're working towards potentially building mutual aid networks and collaborating with like-minded organizations, which is why being a member of BAP has been like integral in building this org.
Yes. So just a follow-up question. Can you give an example of maybe a liberal interpretation of situations that are happening in the Horn of Africa or throughout the diaspora versus a radical or revolutionary interpretation?
Totally. So actually a lot of the biggest conversations we see in the Horn right now, which is, I mean, definitely not limited to the Horn, but across the continent, is this talk of like implementing bourgeois democracy. And how I see bourgeois democracy is like us focusing and honing in on, well, we have to make sure we're fighting for specific elections or freedom of speech for the individual, freedom of the press, etc. Which this is not to say that those potential freedoms, quote unquote, are not like necessarily like bad things to have, but we're talking about freedom of speech and freedom of the press to people that are like starving, that don't have like running water, power, all of these things, right? So when this talk of like human rights is really big right now in the Horn, of like making sure that individuals have like the like same liberties and rights as those in the West, which again is like a really big misconception for like all Black people. We like find they love to talk about human rights in the sense of like bourgeois like types of rights, in my opinion, right? But not necessarily like the right to like running water, the right to like being able to have food and like electricity. So those are the biggest liberal conversations being had.
I got you. So what you're talking about is like what Ajamu Baraka has sort of coined as people-centered human rights, as opposed to this sort of liberal regime of individualism. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's amazing. Okay. So HOA PALS recently launched the Shut Down AFRICOM Somalia campaign, and you all have an event coming up on this Saturday, March 13th, as a matter of fact, so you can speak about that. But can you explain the role of the U.S. in Somalia, the role of AFRICOM in East Africa more broadly, and why is it necessary to be taking up this campaign right now?
Yeah, for sure. So firstly, to speak to why we're doing this now, I mean, just as of recently, like the Biden administration decided to just launch some airstrikes in the beginning of Black History Month to, I guess, commemorate Black people, which is just incredible, I guess. Yeah. But we decided to specifically over this campaign, to give a little bit of context. So obviously kind of BAP has really been big about launching the Shutdown AFRICOM campaign as a whole. But we wanted to hone in a bit on AFRICOM's presence within the Horn of Africa. So obviously the US ruling class continues to defend the existence of AFRICOM on the basis that like it stems from this rise of extremist organization in Africa, right? But we wanted to point to the fact that like the Pentagon has been in Somalia long before like this organization has even existed, AFRICOM, right? Because in 2001, the Bush administration dispatched the CIA and a bunch of like Special Operations Command to Somalia to support all of these warlords in hunting down and killing of Islamists, which again, we can get into like the semantics of what do they deem as like extremists, terrorists, etc. But the Bush administration began an undeclared war in Somalia, launching all of these airstrikes as part of the nation's imperialist expansionist effort, as per usual. And they referred this to the war on terror. And notice that like during that time, we saw a lot of propaganda in like Hollywood, as like people were talking about like all of these Somali pirates, having all these movies about an incredible like US military, like really trying to defend these like their honor and things like that. And so that was something that was brought up that was strategic. But these drone and airstrikes were and are conducted by AFRICOM, which was established in 2007, right? And later expanded under Obama. So since then, we've seen over like hundreds of thousands of Somalis displaced and thousands of Somalis actually murdered as a result of these drones, cruise missile strikes, etc. But so on top of the fact that they're already launching all of these things in response supposedly to terrorism, there's clearly an interest in terms of like Africa's natural resources. So AFRICOM, obviously we'd like to say, is ushering in this like a scramble for Africa, basically redefined. And in the case of Somalia, the oil corporations of Europe, the US, and Canada are engaged in the search for like petroleum. So if we know that Somalia's coastline is on the Indian Ocean and is an access point to the Arabian Peninsula, and we also have like the Red Sea, this particular area is significant geopolitically for the control of like shipping lanes, but also primarily for energy resources and the military. And because Eritrea is not letting up, they're not allowing any US bases near that country, and considering Eritrea technically controls like the Red Sea, they have had to find other forms of like control in the area within the Horn. So that's the biggest thing that's going on within AFRICOM's presence in East Africa, and they're only trying to, I guess, heighten their presence.
And this is in combination with the conflict that's ongoing in Ethiopia currently, right? And the U.S. machinations are all up in that. That's another conversation, but it's U.S. imperialism is relentless, right? And so we need to be equally relentless with our anti-imperialism. So thank you for illuminating that. So switching gears a little bit. On a recent BAP webinar, I believe it was in February, you mentioned the quote influencer industrial complex, and I just love that term, right? And how youth activists are pushed into a neoliberal pipeline that undermines their radical politics. So, what has been your experience with this whole effort to, the neoliberal pipeline, and how can young Black radical activists and organizers combat the effort to sort of de-radicalize them?
Yeah, for sure. So this is really, really important for me because I always say this. I was so close to kind of being, and I don't necessarily just like, y'all already shouted her out, so like the Amanda Gorvins of the world, right? Like someone who is tokenized and used by the empire in order to like exact their interests, and they could care less about my community. So specifically with me and how I see it. First, I kind of want to give a shout out to all the like radical orgs and community orgs that like, despite the fact that like they have to battle all of the like gentrification and segregation and things like that that's happening in college towns and stuff, they continue to find ways to radicalize students, which is incredible. But that's never really like something that as soon as you become like a college student, I'm speaking for college students, like when you go to orientation or when you're like in this college town, that's not immediately accessible or open to you. So you're seeing like campus as like a euphoric, like city in and of itself, and you're looking for opportunities within campus to be involved, right? And mostly, especially for people who want to get involved politically. So they end up joining like a college Democrats organization, or maybe a DSA. So this
NAACP. I was a member of the NAACP campus chapter before I became the president of Black Student Government. So it's true. It's
Yes. Yeah. So you're presented with those opportunities, and you're like, this is a way to get involved. So when you get to that point, then like as soon as you find there to be a problem with the way these organizations are engaging, like you notice, you're like, this is kind of sus, like the things that we are potentially like wanting to quote unquote fight for. And I'll give an example for myself. I mentioned that I was student government president this past year. I came in and I ran a campaign that was like, I would say the closest to being like policy focused. It was probably one of the first campaigns that decided to address or attempt to address this idea of wage, labor. Like we were like, we need to increase the minimum wage. Like, why are we getting paid $7.25? Like that is literally trash. So we were talking about that. And I was like, so I ran this campaign telling everyone like, we deserve to get paid more. And I was one of the first people to talk about like race disparities in terms of accessibility to services and things like that. Then, I got elected. Awesome. And I'm finally in those spaces and I'm like, I want to make good on the promises that I made. I go to those spaces, I start talking to them as if I feel like I have the power. Like I thought that like I had power. And I was met with like outright, like flat out no's, like we don't have money. We don't have any of these things. And then I started to realize that like I was getting used for like the next few months. And in the way that I was getting used is I was invited to all of these like dinners with alumni and like all of their donors, and they said, look at, so like,
they're parading around their like Black student body president.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So I got to a point where I was like, well, okay, I have to decide, do I keep shucking and jiving, or do I actually like resist? And I, realized there was an incident that happened on our campus that like forced me to make that conclusion early on. I realized I need to resist because that's like completely antithetical to what I believe in. So then I attempted to like resist. I attempted to be transparent about what was happening with administration. And I essentially got like blackballed. It was really, really difficult to move within those spaces. I was told I was like a difficult person, all of these things. But then I noticed in other organizing spaces that I was in, that like if you choose not to resist and you choose to be a part of the system as a way in this idea that you're going to make change, you get rewarded. I was punished, but there were people, my peers, that were getting rewarded for also outing me. They were putting students, right? Like, for example, in NAACP and other orgs, that as long as they were another Black face that actually listened to them and weren't willing to like challenge them on issues of like, what's happening with the custodial staff? Why are they they're not getting paid as much? I started making these connections and they were not having it. So then I saw what was like these students that were actually like I said, like shucking and jiving, they continued to get rewarded in like having recommendation letters from administration, getting invited to a lot of other things. But this is kind of a smaller example to speak to how I see this happening on a national scale. So I know that young people have been engaged in organizing efforts for forever, but I would say that this idea of the influencer, like industrial complex for youth activists didn't start personally till white people started trying to do this shit. So like, for example, March for Our Lives was a pivotal moment in being able to commodify activism for young people. And I'll specifically speak to that because we noticed how when they started talking about gun violence, they started talking about it obviously with schools and specifically for white students. But then they realized once it was getting to a national scale, we're like, we need Black people to make it look equal. So they brought in some Black people that were willing to basically be the face for them. Once that happened, these Black people were getting invited to do these talks. They were getting brand deals on Instagram. And if you think about it, these people that in these spaces that I was engaged with, for example, were getting brand deals talking about wear sustainable, like items of sustainable clothing to combat climate change. Meanwhile, those pieces of clothing were made by like Bengali children for $2 an hour. Like I don't, so there's no class analysis, there's nothing. It's because we're just a bunch of sheep that are being herded into a direction that we feel like, because we're not educated and because we are told we don't have to read, that we don't have to like engage with older folks, that we are, you know, really, we can do things on our own. We continue to like remake the same spaces that folks in other generations have already been doing the work for. So we notice a lot of like mini nonprofits like come up that are like youth led as like a cool slogan. And that's what continues to like become the commercialization, I think, of activism. And I know that it's happened for a long time, but with Gen Z and with like this idea of like viral moments, it's happening more and more. People go viral for saying like one good thing, and then all of a sudden they're lauded as like the next like Assata Shakur. Like it's actually criminal, like the way that they make these connections. So it's really a problem. It all stems from political education. We're not educated yet, and we're not willing to be educated because we're getting all these rewards for not being educated.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because you're being miseducated. So these are people who have formal training, and it's funny. There was a comment on the prophetess Jackie Lukman. We'll talk about her in a second, but on her Instagram about you know, being autodidactic. And so, you know, somebody had commented that, you know, a lot of our people are autodidactic. And I commented, I'm formally trained, but I'm also autodidactic because I have to guard against the miseducation. And I have to learn so many things on my own. So it's interesting that, you know, the formal education system is actually creating the conditions for the lack of education in the critical areas like challenging imperialism, neocolonialism, capitalism, and being able to actually spot the influencer industrial complex and those sorts of things. So, so thank you. That was extremely illuminating. And I hope that your peers are taking note. So finally, why Pan-Africanism, right? And why Black radicalism? Why are they urgent in these moments? Why have you committed yourself to these principles? And why do you think that other young people should do so when clearly it's more lucrative, right? You can get your kids or your vans or Toms or whatever, you know, and, you know, you can sustainable capitalism like that. If that's the wave, why Pan-Africanism and Black radicalism?
Yeah, so that's a great question. For me, I think that the biggest reason why I wasn't able to, I think, get into those spaces and feel okay with being in those spaces is because like I had to like look at my family every day and like being able to engage with them in discussions. And for a little bit of background, my family was from Eritrea, and our Eritrea was like officially liberated and independent as a country in 1991. So literally like 8 years before I was born, they were fighting like a 30-year like armed struggle, and they were a revolutionary Marxist organization. So it's weird talking to like my family and like my cousins and aunts and uncles who have like literally fought for like self-determination and fought for like these rights that they know that they have, and in such an amazing way, and being able to like use those stories and use that as a way to like climb the social ladder. I got to a point where like it just I couldn't sit with myself knowing that that's what I was doing. So specifically for like why Pan-Africanism, it's kind of gotten to the point for me where that's literally the only answer I have for a lot of people saying, well, what do we do? What do we strive for? And a lot of times I've noticed that like, especially as a student, and in a lot of like these like young spaces that are like Black student unions and like African student organizations, things like that, who have radical history behind them, like in the ways that they engaged for like decades ago, which is beautiful, but has like become so pacified since then. And I noticed that Pan-Africanism in this way for so long has been part of like this bigger commercialization of our culture. And it's been reduced literally to like wearing onks and like being talking about, well, you know, we are like true Africans, like we need to go back to Africa. That's the way that we solve all of our problems. I like couldn't sit there in good faith and just allow like that to happen. So I think for me, Pan-Africanism is quite literally the answer, but also it's about telling everyone that Pan-Africanism is a political objective. It's something that like we're working towards. It's this process of like economic unification, and all of these problems that we're facing here and abroad have to do with the economic organization of the continent. And that has been the biggest thing that I think people are missing out. But at the end of the day, Pan-Africanism is the answer because we need a cultural revolution. Like that is what we're missing. And I know people have talked about this for so long, but I see students, especially my peers, like they're eager and they want to be able to engage in these things. So I feel like if I already am starting to read on everything, why would I hoard this knowledge from other folks? So definitely, I think Pan-Africanism is that. It needs a big revival personally, I think in our culture. It's always been there, but it's just been so diluted. So,
So who are you reading? Who are the Pan-Africanists that are inspiring you right now?
Actually, so our group is reading The Invention of Ethiopia. I don't know if like that's something that y'all have heard of, but it's a really great book that like talks through and delineates like what actually happened in Ethiopia and how colonization has really like affected essentially like the formation of the states there. So those are the big things. And I think personally, we just also finished How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. So I always have to shout out Walter Rodney.
Of course.
He changed my entire outlook on everything.
Yeah.
So just shout out to him.
Yeah. You know, I identify as a Rodneyist. Like, you know, people are like, what does that even mean? Yeah. It's like, you know, Marxist, Rodneyist. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yo, Leon, this has been such an amazing conversation. Anything you want to shout out? Like, where can people find you? What should people look out for from you, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, y'all can find me on like all social medias, but I would definitely want everyone to check out the PALS like webinar that's happening this Saturday. We're going to really talk a lot about what's happening, what it means for Afrikaan to be present in Somalia and how that's affecting all of us around the world. So tune into that on Saturday, and please follow us on like all of our social because we'll have more information about campaigns in the future.
Perfect. We'll have all that information up on the screen. So thank you so much for joining me, and I can't wait to have you back again.
Thanks. I appreciate it. This was dope.
Of course. Bye. All right, y'all. So we have this another new segment called In These Comments that's kind of a riff off of In These Tweets. So Jared, this was your idea. So do you want to explain, you know?
All right. So yeah, to borrow from where you had started us with In These Tweets, I just noticed that in the comments and chats during the airings of The Last Dope Intellectual are fire, as is always the case with BPM materials. And so I thought it'd be kind of interesting if we went through some of the comments from previous episodes, or in this case, the last episode, and just have you and us respond to them. So there were a couple. One of them is sort of more a point of order that comes from Too Black. Shout out to Too Black, where he said, oh, the shit is still going. And I just wanted to point out that after you have an incredible interview segment like the one we just had, the show is still going. So last week, after No Name and Erica killed it in your discussion, there was some confusion when we played, her track Rainforest, which is dope. That was the end of the show. Like, people figured it can't get any higher. Like, they can't go any higher. So I just wanted to quickly point out the show's not over when you finish these incredible conversations. So that was just one point of order for the LDI faithful, so that there's no confusion, because we don't want people to go away just because one dope segment ends. So,
and listen, y'all wanted longer shows, so like, sometimes they might be shorter, sometimes they might be longer, but they've gotten longer as we've gone on. So stay past the 30-minute mark.
That's it. So don't go until it's over. That's it.
Period.
Like let the credits roll. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly.
So on this one, oh wait, this one, there's a couple here that I wanted that one of which I wanted to respond to most because I took I felt a certain kind of way about it personally. About this is what I wanted to ask about. You were doing a segment, all of this is related to the Cornel West segment from last show, and you were talking about obviously where should we all stand in defense of Cornel West, and there's a question here from Baba Lukman that I wanted to have you maybe come back to, where he asks, do you think celebrity cheapens academia? And I thought that was a very interesting question that didn't get brought up. And so I wanted to have you, maybe respond to that real quick here. What do you think about that? Or do you have thoughts about celebrity in academia?
I think so. There's like public intellectual, right? I think that when the public starts to crowd out the intellectual, that's when it becomes a problem. I think that when the celebrity or when when it's sort of celebrity for celebrity's sake, as opposed to, being outward facing so that you can democratize or share your work, I think that that's when it becomes a problem. And then there are quote unquote scholars, which, or I guess just academics who are famous just for being famous. And I think that actually is a problem. At the same time, I do think that having a more outward facing profile over like when scholars like people like Cornel West, or even I guess maybe Mark Lamont Hill and others, what their sort of outward facing presence has done is allow for other types of things to count towards tenure, for other types of writing to be taken seriously. Even somebody like Robin Kelley, I feel like he's one of the more principled people who have been doing the sort of outward facing work for a while. I mean, that might be different from celebrity.
Right.
But, I was having a conversation with Gerald Horne about the Cornel West situation. And I guess I'm of two minds about that. On the one hand, so Gerald said, this situation with Cornel West can bring attention to the ways that politics are used to sort of undermine people's careers, or can be used to, and so somebody like Cornel West will bring attention to the issue in ways that like a random like me or whomever else, like nobody would give a fuck, right? On the other hand, so my response was that, yeah, but the other side to that is that it might be that we only care when it happens to prominent people, and we still don't care when it happens to other people. So there ain't no really trickle down empathy in that way. You know what I'm saying? And so it can really go either way. And so to make a short story long, in terms of responding to Baba Lukman's question, I think that if celebrity stands in for like doing engaged, rigorous, meaningful scholarship, absolutely cheapens academia. But I do think that there's a way in which people who do principled and relevant work, who have a sort of a prominent status, can help to change some of the biases or elitism in academia.
This other one very quickly was related to part of the discussion you all were having last week in terms of the differences between socialism and democratic socialists. And Marcus Louison, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing this, said that democratic socialists is basically soft capitalism, that you can't get down with it. And I'm only bringing it up here, obviously, for you to comment on as much as you like, but I wanted to just remind people that in the description of the last episode of the Last Dope Intellectual, this is why I put that what I think is classic audio from the debate between the late Amiri Baraka and Bill Fletcher around Manning Marable's work on Malcolm X, because Baraka argues that what was underneath all of that was this difference between democratic socialism and socialism proper, or Marxist-Leninism. So anyway.
But I think that the other thing to understand about the BRC is that everybody was a democratic socialist. It was really a kind of popular front or united front, because people like Abdullah Kalamat and Sundiata Chajua were involved as well. And I hardly think they identify as social democrats. And so you had them alongside people like Barbara Ransby and Manning Marable, who probably are more inclined toward democratic socialism. And so I just don't want to erase the actual Marxist Leninists and the revolutionary nationalists and the other cadres that were there alongside, which is why I had also mentioned perhaps including them in a sort of second edition of that book, because there were different tendencies and different factions, and some argue that might be why it didn't last. Also, people like Rose Brewer, so I think that it's not just the BRC is not just reducible to democratic socialism, even though that might have been the tendency that became predominant. So
no, right on. It's a very good point. This other one comes from back to the Cornel West piece, and this was really the one that touched closest home to me. This because this comes up all the time in popular criticism of criticism of popular academics like Cornel West, where Mr. Untouchable says he crying about his bag. How come he never worked at a Black university? And there's a lot I would want to say, and we'll one day say more about in terms of HBCUs and Black universities. I just wanted to quickly say that this is a big, I think, misperception that carries too much in our communities. That this idea that the Black university is this radical space where Black intellectuals can do their thing and impress upon the minds of young Black people, and the other is that there's a misnomer or misunderstanding of what happens to academics within the HBCU experience, and where often you have more teaching loads, you have less funding opportunities, a lower salary in most cases, so you can't end up producing in the way, both as a public intellectual or as just a highly productive academic at an HBCU in most cases that you can in PWIs. And then, as I often ask people, I would even ask you this, is that what is the last major intellectual work produced by a Black academic while working at an HBCU? And I struggle to come up with examples, particularly in modern history, of that. So anyway, so that's just something I just want to say in defense of not only Cornel West, but just in general of Black academics who are often criticized, I think, by folks for not choosing to teach at HBCUs. It's not the ideal experience, I think, that a lot of academics hope to have in many cases. So I just, anyway, did you want to, anyway, that was.
Yeah, I would say the last two major works I read from scholars produced at HBCU. One is We Are Worth Fighting For by Josh Myers, which came out in 2019, late 2019, early 2020. And The Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power by Jared Ball. I think he's Black. He's awfully light. I think he's Black, who's a professor at Morgan State University. So it does happen.
I appreciate that. Right on. Okay, so right on. Fair enough. The last one is just a quick point that came up during the Black Radical brunch that you and your friends had, which was fantastic, which will be available shortly to everybody to see. And it started with something I said. I just wanted to shout out the rest of the group for picking up on it, because not only did you all and your crew, I think, wonderfully lay out a critique of France that I think they often get away with or away from. But everybody in the chat picked up on it, because I think at BPM we have such a dope audience that they picked up on. So I was happy to see the dragging of France. That I think get too much credit and too much positive discussion, particularly surrounding the Second World War and all of that. But that was it. So I just, those were just some of the comments I wanted to bring to your attention from the last couple of episodes of LDI and LDI related media. So
yeah, France is trash too. It's just like other European or European imperial powers, and they smoke a lot there. Yeah. I see Europe in general, but like that's what, like, the United States is a dumpster fire, but I think we really got on top of the smoking thing. Europe, they did not, and it is disgusting. And so, no shade to people who smoke, but I think
a little shade. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is shade. I don't know why I said no shade, but it's cigarettes. Other things do you, but cigarettes in particular, ugh. So, okay. So keep the comments coming, y'all. Keep engaging in the chat. And you might see your comment appear in these comments. So thanks, Jared, for introducing, for imposing that segment upon my show. All right, y'all. So another new segment. I promise you at some point, all the segments will have been introduced, but this is one I am particularly excited about. It's called Left Disquisition. And so just for, to define key terms, disquisition is a formal discourse or treatise in which a subject is examined and discussed, right? So in Left Disquisition, I want to talk about what's being talked about, discussed, analyzed, commented on, or critiqued on the platforms that I learned from. And this includes Hood Communists, By Any Means Necessary, The Punch Out, Black Agenda Report, Black Agenda Review, Red Nation, The Groundings Podcast, and of course, other shows on the Black Power Media Network. And so today I really want to engage with a monologue from the illustrious People's Prophetess, Jackie Luqman, from the other day, from International Women's Day. And this was a monologue she gave on the By Any Means Necessary podcast. So Jared, can you run that track, please?
And today is International Women's Day, first observed by the United Nations on March 8, 1975. Now, while we in the U.S. like to observe the day and the accompanying Women's History Month as a sort of generic catch-all for all the amazing things women have done to contribute to the development of this country, the origins of honoring women's contributions came out of the labor struggles in the 1900s. In 1909, the Socialist Party of America, that's right, the Socialists, designated February 28th to honor the 1908 garment workers' strike in New York, where women protested against unfair working conditions. Then in 1909, the Socialist Party of America issued a declaration that the first National Women's Day be observed in the U.S. on that same day. Then, at the Second International Conference of Working Women, held in Copenhagen, Denmark in 1910, the first was held in Stuttgart, Germany in 1907, Clara Zetkin, the leader of the Women's Office for the Social Democratic Party in Germany, proposed that every year in every country, there should be a celebration on the same day, a Women's Day, to press for the demands for women's rights to work, vote, be trained, to hold public office, and to end discrimination. The proposal was approved, and International Women's Day was established and recognized for the first time on March 19th the next year in Austria, Denmark, Germany, and Switzerland. More than 1 million women and men attended IWD rallies around the world, but there was little to no recognition in the U.S. until the horrific Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911 that cost the lives of 146 Jewish and Italian immigrant women. The acquittal of the owners of the factory, known for their anti-union positions and activities, sparked organizing among and for women workers across racial and ethnic lines in the U.S., which resulted in many of the fire safety laws we still implement in the workplace today. And women continued to engage in the struggle for workers' rights, playing a significant role in the 1912 Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Thousands of mostly female workers engaged in a lengthy, well-organized, and successful walkout, standing firm against an entrenched group of mill owners and their hundreds of militia and police. Workers maintained soup kitchens and nurseries for children. Meetings were simultaneously translated into nearly 30 languages, and representatives from every nationality formed a 50-person strike leadership group. Then in 1917, Russian women began a strike for bread and peace in response to the death of over 2 million Russian soldiers in World War I and for the fight for Russian women to vote, which they ultimately won after 4 days of strikes when the Russian Tsar abdicated and the provisional government granted Russian women their right to vote. The date the women's strike commenced was Sunday, February 23rd, on the Julian calendar, then in use in Russia. But this day, on the Gregorian calendar in use everywhere else, was March 8th. And that is how we get to today's International Women's Day observation. So International Women's Day is not just about recognizing women's history. It is literally about declaring that a woman's place in history is in the labor struggle. Follow Lukman Nation on patreon.com/LukmanNation for lots of great content.
For lots of great content. That, I'm sorry, but that last line was bars. And mind you, Jackie Lukman has many amazing monologues, so I highly recommend you catch them at the beginning of each By Any Means Necessary episode. But what I want to say about that monologue, that International Women's Day or International Working Women's Day monologue that Jackie gave, is the way in which it challenges intellectual McCarthyism. And so, as she explained, the United States has an uncanny ability to turn every fucking holiday into a capitalist, liberal, superficial, identitarian holiday. And so what Jackie restores to International Women's Day is its internationalism, its roots in labor organizing, its roots in working class and poor women, and its roots in challenging capitalist exploitation and the ways in which corporations and the state they concede nothing without struggle and without demand, and that women have often been at the forefront, and not only women, but marginalized women. So for example, these Italian and Jewish women, immigrant women, who of course are seen as disposable by the state, right? And so I think that Jackie's monologue is really important because it challenges the erasure of, for example, the Bolshevik women who struggled for days in order to get voting rights, and for whom March 8th actually is, we celebrate the day on March 8th because of those particular women, but also the earlier modes of organizing and striking and challenging the system that also created the demand that we actually acknowledge and celebrate women. Right. But not celebrate women in some sort of abstract way, but position them as at the forefront of the most meaningful struggles of our time. And so this is not no girl boss shit. This is not like some abstract, the future is female, but rather, as Jackie said, the place of women is in the labor struggle, which is to say that we as women, right, we are, especially as racialized women, for example, who are often the heads of household, often the breadwinners, and even when we're not, we still have a responsibility to our communities, to ourselves, and to our comrades to be in struggle, to be in organizations, and to be in community. Claudia Jones speaks to this exact issue in her article, An End to the Neglect of the Problem of the Negro Woman, that Black women are at the forefront of struggle because of our particular, what I call structural location, but our particular role in the capitalist mode of production. And so all of that to say, what Jackie's monologue conveys is that these imperialist women, these, mammies of empire, these women who only operate in service of the state and in service of reconstituting our oppression, immiseration, and exploitation, these are not the women that need to be acknowledged on International Women's Day. These are the women that the actual women for whom International Women's Day was founded are challenging. These are the women that they would reject. These are the women that are part of the problem, right? And so I think that it would serve us well to keep in mind the radical, insurgent and militant roots of many of these holidays that too often become reduced to a Hallmark greeting card or some sort of party or whatever. And so, I'm thankful to Jackie for narrating the International Women's Day in that way, because I knew about the Soviet aspect. I did not know about these earlier sort of 1909 roots. And so I'm grateful to always be learning from comrades like Jackie Lukman, but also grateful for the ways in which we challenge the erasure, obscuring, discrediting, and co-opting of radicalism generally, but Black radicalism particularly. Okay, y'all, as I spoke about in the last episode, our first segment of The Doctor's In is here. And so I have a few questions that both Jared and I will respond to, some really, really good questions. Hey, some of y'all sent some raggedy shit, and so I'm not even going to entertain it, but here are the questions that we're going to talk about. All right. So what's the first one, Jared?
So the first one from Twitter, quote, if we're starting a liberation school and needed to put together a curriculum, what books, movies, videos, etc. would you suggest? That is a very good question and an exciting one, I think.
It's a great question. And of course, I'm going to be typical me. Anything Walter Rodney, but particularly how Europe underdeveloped Africa, that's just standard. I think that's just standard canonical reading. Claudia Jones.
I want to be a Rodneyist too, by the way. I liked how you said that. I want to be a Rodneyist.
Okay, well, get your studying up. One day you too can be a Rodneyist. I'll joke. You're like, whatever. It's just a shorthand for Black Marxists, right?
Sure.
So another, an end to the neglect of the problems of the Negro woman. I think it does a good job of analyzing triple oppression. I would absolutely, in terms of film, this might be controversial, but I always show it in all of my classes, and that is 500 Years Later, produced by M.K. Asante. I think so. There, and it's a good discussion film because there's a lot of great information, but then there's also some stuff like, what? So it's a way to sort of bring out some of the contradictions of Pan-Africanism and of the different sort of ideologies that permeate, our realities as Black people. I absolutely think that if you want a sort of Hollywood film to analyze and dissect, Sorry to Bother You. Of course, I'm partial to that one because I think it gets into the importance of unions, into class dynamics and other important issues. I think you should incorporate podcasts. And so, By Any Means Necessary is a wonderful one. Eugene Puryear's new podcast, The Punch Out. What else do I listen to? The Groundings podcast, of course, Black, the various things from Black Power Media. Other texts, I would say you have to include some Cabral for sure. I would say some speeches by Maurice Bishop. And it, in terms of, I think it might be useful to engage with some of the Black feminist scholarship and the different, thinking Black or like intersectionality alongside triple oppression or triple exploitation. But I would say in a broader sense, definitely, you can definitely do it chronologically. So definitely start with also prior to slavery. So start with sort of so-called pre-colonial Africa, I would say, and move through to the present. And also make sure that you have clearly defined objectives for each of the lessons that you're trying to convey. But I definitely would say, don't start with slavery because our history, our culture, our experience does not start in slavery. And definitely be attentive to region, be attentive to different genders, different classes. And, so that's just my sense of when I put together, for example, my syllabi or my curriculum for my courses, that's what I would suggest. But what about you, Jared?
All of that is, of course, great. One of the first things that came to my mind in terms of movies, of course, is the Battle of Algiers. I think that should be on there. I think the less discussed film that does a lot of that work in a Black American context, I think, is the film Uptight. And I've always thought that, not to give it away, but I think it's interesting that Julian Mayfield has to die in that film to be reincarnated, I think, within another 2 years as the Mac. And I think that there's something political and intentional happening there. And if
let me interject one more film.
Yeah, please.
A Great and Mighty Walk. That,
of course.
Single-handedly, that is, when I came to my Afrocentric consciousness, that is single-handedly the movie, A Great and Mighty Walk, John Henrik Clarke. Okay, continue.
Yeah, and I just use that this semester. In fact, almost every semester, and that's why it was unfortunate for me, at least, to see Wesley Snipes and Coming to America too, given that he narrated and funded A Great and Mighty Walk. St. Clair Bourne, shout out to the late great St. Clair Bourne as well. Anyway, so that would definitely be on it. By the way, 500 Years Later, I've used that a lot in my classes as well. I think it's a great discussion starter, even if you find points of criticism. It's great for that. There's so much more. I think all of the traditions of radical Blackness that are described in the works of Dr. CBS and on this show, I think, are a great place to start. The conversations you've already had in the first 5 episodes preceding this one, I think would be not only great for classroom use, but in terms of offering materials to be used as well. So anyway, those are good places to start, and I'm sure we could keep coming up with more. And I think people who, when they see this, and should add theirs in the comment and chat. And I look forward to seeing what people come up with for that as well, because I mean, we could literally sit here for days coming up with great materials, but I think we've certainly pointed people in a great direction for a start. Yeah.
I got to add a few more things. Okay, so on YouTube, there is this channel called Afro Marxist. It is amazing, and one day I will have that curator on this show, because that archive is amazing. It has speeches, interviews, and dialogues with people from Angela Davis to Kwame Ture, to Julius Nyerere. Just so many Pan-African and radical thinkers, activists, scholars, organizers. So that's an amazing resource. And Gerald Horne, Doy. And, you know, the best, the place I'm telling people to start these days is with the trilogy, which is The Dawning of the Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, and the Counter-Revolution of 1776. Of course, as we talked about previously, it's a octology, really, but those three are also very good. Now, you want to take several weeks to sit with each of those texts because they're very dense. You also might ask Dr. Horne to come in and speak about those texts, but you know, I gotta throw in some Gerald Horne just for the culture. So hopefully that was helpful. All right, what's next?
So next from Dr.-CBS.com is, quote, "Hey, Dr. CBS, in your 4th episode, you talked with a couple of different guests about how you're down on Marx, the man, as recommended reading, especially because of how much Black writers have brought to the subject of Marxism. For someone who's just getting to Marxism, where would you recommend people start instead of Marx? Would it be mostly like Fanon or Cedric Robinson? Or what other kinds of stuff should people be reading if they're still pretty uninformed about Marxism? Thanks, much appreciation. Y'all are killing it at BPM," end quote. And good question, and a correct observation there at the end as well. And thank them for that as in addition. But where do you suggest people go for Black readings of Marx?
Well, I will also, so I'm not against reading Marx, right? And I would say, like, the Communist Manifesto is really accessible in terms of laying out the sort of ideology of communism, especially at that particular historical moment. But I think reading something like Kwame Nkrumah's Neocolonialism, Walter Rodney, again, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And actually, so the homie Olufemi Taiwo actually has like a sort of blog about reading Capital. And so that might be useful. He's a Black philosopher at Georgetown. That might be useful for, he's Nigerian, I guess I should say. So that might be useful for when you want to delve into some of the more, some of the classical Marxist texts, but, and also reading people who are actually like in the parties. And so again, I always recommend Claudia Jones, William Patterson, also the work by Gerald Horne. So for example, Black Liberation, Red Scare, Ben Davis and the Communist Party, where he talks about not only the man Ben Davis, but also all of the different interventions that communists generally and Black communists particularly were making at a particular moment. But again, I don't got nothing against reading like Marx or Lenin or Mao or anything like that. My thing is that, you know, people always critique the Eurocentrism of Marxism as if Black people had not been innovating upon those writings for a very, very long time. You might also read, Amir Cabral. I think there's one of his collections of speeches is Return to the Source. So, those are just, some of my suggestions alongside some of the texts that I mentioned in the previous, with the previous question, like Claudia Jones's and Into the Neglect of the Problem of the Negro Woman. It's because what you're really looking for, what I'm looking for is what are the intersections of like race and class? What are the ways in which these are mutually constitutive, and how is super exploitation, that is to say the form of exploitation that goes above and beyond the exploitation of the white working class, how is that related to issues of imperialism, neocolonialism, warmongering, et cetera. So those are just some places to start. And also, like, as a friend of the show, Erica Keynes always recommends read in groups, like read in community, and that's also going to help you get through the more dense and difficult material. But, you know, for me, I just never started with Marx. I came to Marxism through, you know, through Black, Caribbean, African, you know, Black American thinkers, and then circle back. And so that was illuminating for me because I saw how it was useful to them. And then it sort of gave me a different way of reading, like the more classical texts like Marx and Lenin. So
all that I think is great. I would just add from my 2 cents quickly that it's interesting because I was encouraged by Black radicals as a young man to read Marx first and Lenin first, to get the foundation of what would later be criticized by the Black writers they suggested I listen to later, focus more on later. So I did try, but to your point, reading in isolation doesn't work, especially with a lot of this stuff. You know, I'm not the sharpest, but I'm no dummy. And reading Marx alone is I wouldn't recommend that beyond maybe the Communist Manifesto. I've struggled with Capital for years. I took David Harvey's online, free web course on Capital, which I found very illuminating. But to your point, he's a white. So I think your suggestion of this brother at Georgetown is I'm going to sign up probably as soon as we finish with this. Because I think Marx is essential. I think he should be read. I think Lenin should be read. But to the point of the questioner, and I think of your work, that's not where you stop and certainly form your own basis. But I think it's good to struggle with that work. I would also just quickly add, of course, you've pointed these people out and the like, but obviously Paul Robeson. I think people when you read what people like Robeson did with Marxism and socialist ideas is maybe not a direct, discussion of Marx per se, but an example. Certainly Hubert Henry Harrison and people like that. Oh, yeah. Harry Haywood. I mean, all these, these folks, look at what not only maybe what they said specifically about Marx, Amiri Baraka, but what they did with those ideas in the context of anti-colonial pro-Black struggle, I think is essential. So anyway, but those are great questions for sure. Yeah,
and James Boggs, of course, the stuff from the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. All of those things are, various shades of Marxism and Marxism-Leninism and Maoism. The Black Panther Party, of course, and so George Jackson. I don't know how I didn't lead off with George Jackson. Angie D too, whatever. All right, so because to me, I mean, I guess, and I understand, elders and people saying start with Marx to anticipate the criticisms. But to me, I start with the criticisms because the criticisms are my starting point. Like I start with the Black, you know what I mean? And so and again, as you were saying, what are people doing with getting the nuances of Capital seems just very, or, reading, Grandrisa or whatever, that just seems less relevant to me than than the sort of path I took. But of course, I'm biased because that's the path I took. And so people might, I'm a bad Marxist. I'm not even a Marxist. I'm a Rodneyist. So whatever it is. Yeah.
I think all that's most important. My path is not, I think, prescriptive. It was just the one I ended up taking. And anyway, a lot should be done. And I think what you're laying down here with LDI is a great course of sorts for people to follow.
Labor theory of value or whatever. I don't know. Oh, Oliver Cox.
Oh yeah, no, I mean,
but he's absolutely not. He's not a Marxist. So he's not a Marxist, but he has a particular engagement with Marx and a particular critique and a reading of Marx. That again, sometimes it is more useful to read a synthesis and go back and read the details and vice versa because you sort of have the language down. You know what I mean? And you have some familiarity than just starting off with because Marx is as Erica has pointed out, a Marx is dry.
and that's interesting. I actually don't find Marx to be dry. I think Marx is exciting to read. I think he's funny, and I think he was a hater. The problem that I have is among many. Among many. I mean, because what I love about Marx, he called everybody out and went hard at folks that he thought were wrong, and I think that's something I've always appreciated. But part of the problem to that point is that if you're not schooled, so to speak, in even the histories that he's critiquing, it's kind of hard. It can be hard to follow. So a lot of the criticisms of people he's talking about, I haven't read their work, and I don't know what So I'm probably missing a lot of inside jokes and details, but. Anyway, my point only is, as much as I may appreciate reading Marx, I certainly don't think that needs to be the end all be all or the starting point. We didn't mention obviously Fanon. We didn't mention Huey Newton. I mean, there's so many other brilliant, I think, criticisms of Marx in the Africana world that bring him to a new level of relevance that I actually think he would have appreciated. But
sure. Yeah, exactly. But of the Marxist works, my favorite always is the 18th Brumaire. Always, always, always. Just, I did a lecture on it that I keep forgetting about, that people keep randomly finding. But
there's even a great book, Letters, that between Marx. There's a book I think called Marx and Engels Writing on the United States. It's just letters about the United States, including a letter that Marx wrote to Lincoln, where he facetiously thanks him for freeing the enslaved because he freed the white working class of Europe. But in that they explain a lot. And to questioner's point, it's even a simpler way of a simplified version of their own arguments, because it's just, you know, more like friendly letters. And one quick point that I think is important in those letters is that they say, look, we only were talking about capitalism because that's the dominant mode of social engagement, or the dominant method by which people engage socially. So they were just trying to figure out the way life is arranged. So their focus on capitalism was because that was the dominant mechanism of the day, and largely still is. So anyway.
Mm-hmm. And then there's also there's another collection, Karl Marx on the Civil War, which is his writings and letters on the Civil War in particular. And all of these like collections, I think, challenge the idea of like Marx being Eurocentric, right? Or the idea that Marx didn't engage with race at all, which, you know, you have to read for it. And, you know, and that argument, you know, only goes so far. And again, a challenge to that argument is like, well, read the Black Marxists then, because they certainly found something to be useful in him, right? And from actual practical things to like state formation to the more, you know, to the scholars and theoreticians. So, yeah.
It's just a lot of people criticize him, then don't read him, and I find that frustrating. So but anyway, so great question, of course, and I think again, what you're doing here is a great response to the question.
All right, okay, last question. What we got?
So last question starts off, I am a graduate student of Morehouse College and a current student of NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. I was inspired by a conversation you had with Jared Ball about Judas and the Black Messiah to write a review of the movie. Out of habit, I'll typically write a paragraph or two about movies I watch, but given the complete and utter erasure of the BPP's politics in this movie, I ended up writing about 10 pages with citations critiquing the movie. What is the process of publishing scholarship such as this? It feels too long to be published in a blog, but more people would see it that way. It feels like it could fit in an academic journal of some sort. However, I'm not familiar with that process, and hiding the critique of the movie behind a paywall would defeat the whole purpose of writing it. The working title of the piece is Judas and the Black Messiah, something involving FBI and propaganda. In it, I'll critique the film aesthetically, then place it in the context of the Hollywood military-industrial complex and argue that there is a deliberate overemphasis on aesthetics and erasure of the actual BPP politics. If you would be open to offering critiques on the piece or forwarding me to more sources on the party, that would also be appreciated. So in other words, I think the question here, end quote. And I think the question here then, just to summarize it, is how do you determine where to publish something you've written? And what do you think that this person here should do with something that is roughly 10 pages and with citations, but that they don't want to hide behind a paywall?
Yeah, so I think, I mentioned this before, but some of Gerald Horne's advice to me was to use every part of the animal. So I think, I think that if you publish it as a blog post, you should also publish it as a peer-reviewed journal article because you're an academic. And so I've never written a blog post that was not part of a broader peer-reviewed work, or that wasn't going to be expanded into a peer-reviewed work, just because it's the same when I do. So usually when I write like a chapter for like an edited collection, that is usually a longer journal article and then a shorter blog post too. So it'll be like a sort of tripartite thing, because the edited collection chapters don't always count for anything, and because they can take 100 years to come out, et cetera, right? So all of that to say, I think that you can publish this as a blog, like whether it's with the Black Agenda Review, whether it's with Hood Communist or some other blog. And if it's 10 pages, you can probably publish it as like a part 1, part 2, part 3. So you'll need to find natural breaks in your argument. And then it'll probably be shorter when you take the citations out. So you'll, with the blog post, as you likely know, you do hyperlinks. The second thing, and I think that you also can, maybe publish it in like, maybe you can, submit it to the Black Scholar or Souls or one of the, or a Black Studies journal. I'm not as familiar with performance studies journals, but I think that that's also viable as well. But doing both it'll give you the sort of outward facing engagement on the one hand, but then it'll also sort of, your labor will go toward tenure. If you're planning, to be in academia, doing a peer review journal article will lend toward, helping your career progress in particular ways. And it's actually really impressive, although much more common now for graduate students to have peer-reviewed journal articles. The other thing that you can do is look for, there are all these different types of calls for edited volume collections. And most certainly there will be one on Judas and the Black Messiah, because that's the nature of the beast. That's what we do. We make everything into something in academia. So that's another thing you can look for. But I think that you're asking the right questions in terms of thinking about like where you want it to circulate, who you want to be in conversation with, and who you want to engage. And so, but it seems to me that the blog post is what you're leaning toward. You're just worried about length. So again, you can publish it as like a series of posts, like either like over 3 or 4 weeks or something, or just they can just break it down some way. So that would be my feedback.
I think a lot of it goes back to the conversation we had last episode about Dr. West and tenure. And I think it has to do with what this person's career interests or goals are, if they're looking for tenure, and then what the criteria for tenure happens to be at whatever institution they're trying to get tenure at. So, because some institutions, frankly, would look well upon a popular blog post, as popular public scholarship. Some administrations actually tell their faculty that they would prefer popular public scholarship to peer review journal articles that nobody sees. So oddly enough, that is sometimes the case, depending on, so it's just case again specific and, what this person's interests actually are. If they just want it to be popularly seen, then they should maybe do the blog route that you suggest and get it out there. But
yeah. Oh, and it's something that's in between the two. A peer review journal article and a blog post is a popular venue like Dissent or Boston Review or even Monthly Review or something of that nature, which is sort of in between.
Now, how do those work though? Do they have to solicit you? Do you have to be solicited for that, or can you just reach out to an editor there and say, "Hey, I have something I would like you to check out"?
I think that people just submit things all the time. As full disclosure, like generally speaking, when I publish in those venues, somebody has recommended me or they have reached out to me. But many people just submit writings, and if it's really good, or there's a whole round of editing that goes with that as well, which is is what it is. But yeah, so you can definitely just submit to those venues, and so that's another route. Jared. You're making me seem like I'm the labor aristocracy. Like,
so what I would,
they just submit
to full disclosure, because I think this is a good conversation for us to have, because we're at, I think, different ends of this academic spectrum where I'm not invited, and I think justifiably I'm justifiably not invited in the same way you and others are to publish in certain spaces. And I have had to reach out and look up the guidelines and submission guidelines and try to find the friendly editor or whatever, just to have an ear for what you're suggesting. So I think, again, not knowing this person's exact location on that spectrum and not knowing their exact interests, that is something that has to be considered. I think you and others have earned justifiably the recognition and the right to be invited by certain more prominent venues for your thought. I mean, honestly, I think that's the case. And I think there's a lot of other brilliant minds out there that deserve it as well. But in terms of who gets targeted, I think you are in that group that deserve it for sure. Others, I don't agree necessarily deserve it. And I think we've been critical of some of them here on this venue, but this platform. But you know, again, I think it is important to recognize that there are those of us who are on this other end of the spectrum, and we have to find ways to get work out and get our tenure on if that's what we want, or to get our popular publication on if that's what we want. And the differences are, you know, important to I think recognize a little bit, pay attention to. So
yeah, and don't be afraid to reach out to people too. So if you happen to know somebody, even if you don't know them, like one thing about me, I'm gonna email somebody and not think twice about it. I don't care. Like if I want them to be on my show now that I have a show, or just if I just want to be in conversation, I'm gonna email somebody and the worst thing they can do is not respond or be horrible in their response, in which case they just go on the vendetta list and I'll circle back to it. But most people are not. I mean, that hasn't been my experience, but like, you know, or if you know somebody, so for example, let us assume you want to publish in Boston Review. You might reach out to not me, because I really don't have clout like that, but you might reach out to somebody else and just ask them, you know, how, you know, get their advice on how to publish. So let's say like Washington Post, for example, I've never published there. You might reach out to somebody that you know who's published there and say, you know, what are the next steps? And I don't have an agent. I don't have anything like that. It's not like that at all, y'all. So like, yeah. So all of that to say, like, don't be afraid to like reach out to people and sort of like, you know, workshop your work or whatever. So
right on. Hey, if they reached out to you, who should they be afraid to reach out to? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely reach out to me.
I'm saying.
Reach out to Jared. So you said at the end of this, you know, if I would be open to offering critiques, Jared would probably be somebody who's better at offering critiques, because I haven't seen the film. So like, what critiques can I offer? Right. And also Jared is a movement man. Like Jared is in them streets in ways that I don't be doing nothing. I mean, that's not true anymore. I am in Black Alliance for Peace, but
you are in the streets.
You know, I'm in these.
I'm in these streets. I would like to see it. I'd like to see it. So I invite this person to send it to me, and then and then I'll run it by you for the stuff I don't understand.
You know? Oh my God. But the other thing too, when you know, in terms of readings, this is just a general thing for sources. Make sure that you all are doing your own search first. Start with the simple Google search or if you're an academic, you have access to JSTOR or Google Scholar. Do your first levels of research first before you ask other people. Like, so put your own effort in. And then if there's something that you can't find or next steps, then ask for further sources. But don't, like, that's sort of like outsourcing your labor. Don't do that. Look first and then circle back.
Good suggestion.
Okay.
The one thing that came to my mind is that I think you should also, because this is a mistake I've made, I think you should also look into at least a little bit the person you're asking for help from. Mm-hmm. So you, beyond just knowing that they're in a certain location, I think it's important to know a little bit about their work when you reach out to them. If for no other reason, academics have egos, and when you're reaching out and saying, you know, basically I'm ignoring your work to get you to help me to get to someone else or to get somewhere else, people have you know, so it's better if you say, look, I appreciate your work on the subject, maybe you can help me. I think that's a better approach. And if you're aware of their work, it helps you get them to respond in the way you want them to.
Yeah. So do a little bit of labor on your own first and then circle back. All right, y'all. So that was our first the Doctors In section. Keep the questions coming. You can send them to dr-cbs.com/contact. Tweet me at BlackLeftAF or DM me on Instagram at BlackLeftAF. And remember, no goofy shit. But if I don't get to your question, that doesn't mean it was goofy shit. Just use your best judgment. Okay, y'all. So what I'm on this week, I just want to give a very brief recap of my writing retreat, which I did last week with my dear comrades, colleague, friends, Dr. Takia Harper Shipman and Dr. Layla Brown Vincent. And so we were gone for about 6 days, and all of us were working on our respective projects. And so part of what we did before we even went on the writing retreat was we hopped on a call and decided, okay, what is it that we want to accomplish? at the end of the retreat. And then we set a schedule for each of the days. Now, we didn't always stick to that schedule, but we definitely wanted to have a plan of action when we arrived and when we started to get to work. And so even if you're doing a writing retreat on your own, even if you just stay in your own home, it's very, very important for you to think about your goals and think about your objectives. So like, what is it that you're trying to complete? And what is it that you want to have completed at the end of each day? And also pay attention to, whether or not it's realistic for you to go through, to write for 8 hours, or if you need to do 2 hours, take a break, 2 more hours, etc. So pay attention to your own writing process, because something that me and the girls discovered was that we needed to work for 2 or 3 days and then have a day off in the middle, and then work for 2 or 3 more days so that we can sort of refresh and rejuvenate and go to the beach or do whatever it is that we're going to do and then get back to work. And so when we do this again, that's something that we'll take into consideration. And so for myself, I wanted to finish the theoretical framework and fill in some of the details in the second chapter that I'm working on. And so I definitely got that accomplished. And particularly what I was building out was this section on true Americanism and the ways in which this idea of true Americanism and its enunciation through democracy, citizenship, and individualism are rooted in anti-radicalism and anti-Blackness. And so I was gathering some sources and just sort of building out that particular argument, specifically the ways in which democracy, the word democracy actually just means sort of, it's really just a sort of metonym for Americanism and a metonym for this sort of rugged individualism. It actually doesn't mean very much, which is why, for example, this discourse of democracy that the United States uses as a guise to invade other countries is simply that. It has nothing to do with enfranchisement. It has nothing to do with actually running quote unquote free and fair elections. It has everything to do with like a will to militarism. And so really unpacking democracy and how this particular notion of democracy is actually meant to keep Black folks and to keep radicals out of this whole idea. And it's rooted in that subjection. So anyway, so that's what I was working on. And I didn't get quite as much done as I thought that I would, because we took a little bit more time off than we had anticipated. But in a general sense, I feel like the retreat was really important because, number one, like, I live alone and I had been spending a lot of time in isolation, and I hadn't actually traveled since like March of 2020. So it was basically a year to the day since I had traveled. And it was really important in that regard to just have some like actual, human connection over a few days. And it was also good because it got me working for a block of time each day on the book to just get back in the rhythm of doing that. And the other thing that I did was kind of cleared my schedule so that I still had a couple talks, couple interviews and some other stuff, but I was mainly focused on writing the book. And so what that reminded me is that I really need to keep my schedule clear, and I really need to stop piling on all of these other engagements and all of these other side projects so that I can specifically focus on the book. Because when I only have that to focus on, I'm far more productive. There's actually just more margin and space in my mind to work on the book project. And so that was a very important reminder, and just getting into the rhythm of setting up my day around writing. So we would wake up, do yoga, have breakfast, do some writing, take a break. So either take a walk or something, or just, chop it up, and then do another section of writing. And that's actually a really productive setup for me. So I really recommend the retreat model, whether you block out 3 days or even just do 1 day. It's something that I did a lot actually last summer. Was I would just do writing retreats on my own. Sometimes I would do it virtually with people online, but just set out a long block of time, set my goals, and then gather all the materials that I needed and just really sit down and write. And so it's been difficult. Like throughout the pandemic, I've spoken previously about the struggles with productivity because I'm not used to writing in my home. But like that retreat model, whether it's a reading retreat, which I can talk about another time, or a writing retreat, is really has really been productive. So, that's what I'm on, just trying to keep the momentum from the retreat, continue to work on this chapter, and continue to move this book forward. So, all right, y'all. So that's what I'm on for this week. But all right, Jared, do you have any closing thoughts?
Only that this was just another great episode. I think we covered a lot. I think you covered a lot. Your guest conversation was, again, fantastic. And again, congratulations on another dope episode, number 6.
Number 6. And y'all, 6 is my favorite number. It's such an important number to me. I'll talk about that perhaps someday. But anyway, all right. So what did we do on this episode? Jared and I shot the shit about whether the niggerati should be exempted from racism and how we should feel about it when they sort of, insert themselves as the paragon of suffering. In the class and session segment, I had a conversation with the dope, amazing, brilliant Yolian Ogbu about HOA pals and about how young activists can avoid the influencer industrial complex. We talked about, Jared's imposed segment in these comments. We addressed some of y'all comments in the chats, which was actually really dope. I introduced a segment, Left Disquisition, where we listened to the People's Prophetess, one of my greatest teachers, Dr. Jackie Lukman, and her segment on International Women's Day, and I offered my thoughts on why it was important. In the Doctor's Inn, we answered, again, some of y'all questions over a range of subjects, not least sort of what does a Black liberation curriculum look like? And then, what I'm on, I talked about my writing retreat and, what was accomplished and, just, go on a writing retreat if you can. It's always productive. That's our show for this Friday evening. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with me. I'm Dr. CBS. That is Dr. Jared Ball, and we are signing off.